also called a prefrontal lobotomy. The 1880s saw the world's first ever lobotomy being performed. It was by a Swiss physician called Burkhardt on a patient that was suffering from schizophrenia. He performed this procedure on a total of 6 patients. 1 died a few days after the surgery and 1 killed himself. The person considered to be the father of lobotomy was Antonio Egas Moniz. He made his decision to pursue lobotomy after he read a paper that was presented to him in 1935. It showed how a chimpanzee who had both of his frontal lobes removed became more cooperative and more willing to finish tasks. After the chimp was being volatile and refusing to do tasks just before the surgery, having temper tantrums and being angry. He was also intrigued by a story of a stockbroker who had both of his frontal lobes removed following a large tumor in the frontal lobe. After the surgery, the stockbroker was better. He felt greater. He was more extroverted. But most importantly to Moniz was that his intelligence was intact. What was Moniz's hypothesis? Mental illness and its abnormal neural connections all originate in the frontal lobe, and his decision was to sever these connections. Psychosurgery is a subsection of surgery to try to cure psychological conditions, and lobotomy in effect was one of them. There were 2 ways to perform lobotomies. Frontal lobotomy, where holes were drilled into both sides of your skull, and this allowed the surgeon to effectively peer into your brain, into the beautiful pink tissue, before they inserted an ice pick-like tool called a Lobotomy to chip away at your brain and sever the connections. And then there's transorbital lobotomy. A surgeon goes behind your eye, into the eye socket, hammering and chipping away at your skull just to get to your brain. The first was made by Moniz, and the second method was created by arguably the most influential man in the world of lobotomy, neurologist Walter Freeman. Freeman found the old procedure too restricting and slow. He wanted to make it more efficient, more streamlined, faster, more effective, use less resources and dedicated tools. So what did he resort to? Well, while the old method used a drill, which I'd argue is a very relatively new device, it's very modern, Freeman in 1946 resorted to using a tool that was first made in the Paleolithic era, 30,000 BC. An hammer. Yeah, that's right. A hammer. Jeremy Clarkson would be very proud of him right now. I mean, who wouldn't want to chip away at someone's skull with a hammer? After hammering at patients' skulls, Freeman's method literally puts a needle inside their brain. And he, quote unquote, I'm literally saying what he said, wiggled it around the brain to try sever connections around the prefrontal cortex and the thalamus to cut up the connections between them. For the most part, this was a faster procedure. He did streamline it. He was successful in it. The old method took up to an hour to complete. This new one took 10 minutes or even less. What started out as a cure for severe mental health conditions was eventually marketed by Freeman as a miracle cure for pretty much everything. Every disease. Even nervous indigestion. Out of the 50,000 people who received lobotomies in the US, Freeman is credited for 3,500 of them. And the youngest recipient of all these lobotomies was just 4 years old. Lobotomy is intended to reduce tension and agitation, and for most patients it did. It was successful. Freeman is quoted as saying that it was only a little more dangerous than an operation to remove an infected tooth. But the reality was that was never the case. On top of their miracle cure behavior, lobotomies had a darker world. They also led to apathy, a lack of concentration, a numb response of emotional responses, and generally a loss of what makes us humans. From the start, there were red flags. Freeman's first patient received her lobotomy to cure her agitated depression, a type of depression that involves symptoms like restlessness and anger. People who have this condition generally don't feel lethargic or slow down. And although she woke up feeling, in her words, happy after the surgery, after her lobotomy, only a few days later, she started to struggle. She started struggling to speak. She felt disorientated. And she even started to feel agitated again. Exactly what Freeman was trying to remove from her. One of the most infamous and sad cases was that of President John F. Kennedy's sister, Rosemary Kennedy, Freeman's arguably most infamous patient. Following a childhood which was filled with developmental delays, she started to have seizures and temper tantrums as she grew older. And for the save face aspect for their family, because she was a sister of a president, not an easy job, let's admit. It's a hard life being world famous like that. So her family wanted to save face in the eyes of the public. Rosemary was arranged to have a lobotomy at the age of 23. And she was awake during the whole procedure. She was awake, talking and reciting poems to doctors. And that was normal in most neurosurgeries. To this day, you want to make sure that you're doing everything correct and not severing the wrong parts of the brain when you're working on the brain. But this was all well if the surgery goes well. Because suddenly, stop. Rosemary goes quiet. And the surgeons know that the operation was now all over. And not necessarily successfully. Following this, Rosemary lost independent function and she was institutionalized for the rest of her life. Another Kennedy with a tragic ending. So the question we all ask ourselves after this is why? Why were these barbaric and seemingly blind science methods so popular in the world? And well, despite the fact that many doctors and psychoanalysts were against lobotomies, the simple fact was the alternative was much worse. By the early to mid 20th century, mental institutions were overwhelmed and overfilled with patients in straitjackets and padded cells who were all subject to physical abuse and neglect, ostracized from the world, not even knowing what society is, not even having a home to live in. Their institutions was not a home. This, coupled with the fact that there were no effective medical treatments for these psychological conditions, meant that lobotomies were literally the only effective cure for these patients. And the media picked up on this. Just like the media affects us and influences it now, it influenced the world back in the early to mid 20th century. It led to the popularity in the culture of medicine of lobotomies. And credit where credit is due, they were remarkable in their effect. A psychiatrist followed up several hundreds of these lobotomy patients in the UK. And his conclusion was, a third were better off after the surgery. A third were unaffected. But a third were for the worse. And facing possible cure for one's mental illness against a life sentence of incarceration in an institution. Well, as one surgeon who was performing these lobotomies said, it was a way out. It was a way out. Luckily, lobotomies fell out of favor in the mid-1950s. This was after the development of effective psychiatric drugs for these life-changing psychological conditions. But till this day, to that 1/3 who were affected for the worse after their surgery, their lives still remain as dark, desolate, and disconnected as this painting.